What's up, everyone? Welcome to the first YouTube video of Kickoff sessions. If you've seen the podcast before, you would have seen over 30 episodes so far that have been listed on Spotify and Apple Podcast. But the time has come to move into YouTube. It's been quite delayed. It's been put on the long finger, but nonetheless, we are here now and here today. So I wanted to move into YouTube once I was a little bit more settled. I think once I had a bit of audio experience, getting settled on Spotify and getting settled on Apple Podcasts. But now it's about time to move into YouTube, take it up a step, check what other things I can do in terms of podcasting, whether it's short clips, whether it's different types of styles of conversations, and share my current podcast as always on YouTube going forward. So to kick off my first episode, which is still episode 38, but it's the first one that's listed on YouTube, is with Graham Allcott. So Graham is deep experience in productivity. That's the whole purpose of today. It's all around productivity, improving your efficiency, and different ways to improve that kind of work-life balance around productivity and stress. And as we know, with careers and different types of careers at the moment, stress is quite high. Working from home can be quite complex. So the idea between today is to catch up with Graham and really understand how we can improve our productivity. Now, Graham himself has many years' experience. He's been the founder of Think Productive for over a decade now. He's also worked with top levels of executives to improve their productivity. He's also came up with a book called How to Become a Productivity Ninja. And his latest book, How to Fix Meetings, again addresses how to fix meetings. So today's purpose is to really break into these different ideas, go a bit more deeper, and get his perspective and his advice for young professionals or anyone at that stage to develop their career. So before we get going on my first episode, if you subscribe, it'd be pretty sweet. If you share, let me know your thoughts, a couple of comments, anything you want to improve on, anything else you see that one needs to improve, just let me know. So I'll leave it right here. Here's my conversation with Graham Walcott. Sweet. Okay, we look pretty good. Graham, how are we doing? You're very welcome.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm doing good, thank you.
Fantastic. Before we started recording, I mentioned that I myself am a big fan of all productivity, different ways of improving productivity, but it could be just from like a health perspective. So it could be diet, it could be training, or it could be actually like work, kind of like tactics and different ways to improve it. So seeing your videos, seeing your book and stuff was kind of enlightening, and it was really helpful because it was like something that's really targeted towards careers, and being a careers podcast, I felt it's a nice match for today.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, just really flattered. It's one of those things when you write books is you never know who's going to pick it up and where in the world and all that sort of thing. So it's always just lovely to connect with people who've connected with my work. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, and that's a big thing as well, is trying to get it to spread, because obviously,
Yeah.
if it's good for one person, it's good for 100 people. I often find. But before we get into some of the detail, can you give us a quick overview of yourself and where you got into the area of productivity, especially from a book, podcast, and your company as well?
Yeah. So I'll start with the now and then I'll tell the backstory. So I'm the founder of a company called Think Productive. So we work all around the world really with some of the biggest companies in the world. You know, we work with eBay and Barclays and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a whole bunch of different companies. And our, I guess our kind of motto, what we're always trying to do in everything that we do with our clients is help them to make space for what matters, and to do their best work. You know, that's really what everything that we do is about. So the main part of my job these days is writing books and podcasts. That's kind of where I spend most of my time and energy. We have a small team in the UK and then a few other different teams in different sort of parts of the world as well. And we've been going a while. So we started in 2009. We actually just recently just went past our birthday again, and it just feels like you know, we did a big celebration when we turned 5 and then the same when we turned 10. And now it's like, oh yeah, we're just a company just maturing. Right. And so we've put in the hard yards there. But the backstory to me getting into productivity was I got into some leadership roles quite early on in my career. So I ended up being the CEO of a small national charity when I was 26. And one of the first things that happened in that job was the phone on my desk rang. And I picked it up and it said, hey, it's the Department of Education. The minister wants to see you, right? So this national charity, small but really influential. I was suddenly working with government and even at one point sat in one of the minister's offices in the Department of Education, and like literally wrote a line that ended up in legislation. Like we just sat in the office, like just writing it with him, it's to do with further education and volunteering. And so that was my world. And I had an amazing team. I had an amazing PA that really kind of helped keep my life in order. And I could sit at my desk and have ideas, and then stuff would happen. And then I finished that job, and then my plan was to go freelance for a while and just do some consultancy, and then get back into another charity job. And then one day I was sat about to do some consultancy just in my spare room in my house in Whitechapel in London at the time. And I'm sat at my desk, and I had an idea, and I looked around to see who could help me with this idea, and I realized that I'm freelance now. I'm on my own. I have no team.
Yeah.
And suddenly it really dawned on me that my own skills around productivity, making things happen, being a completer finisher were just not that great, and I'd gone very quickly into leadership roles. I hadn't really learned and sort of earned my spurs, if you like, as someone that can really just get stuff done and make things happen. I made things happen through leadership rather than through doing. And so I just went through a bit of an overhaul of my own systems, so I started reading all the books and blogs, and just reading different bits of research around things like procrastination and attention and energy and all this stuff. And then just started devising systems for me, really. That's where it came from. Was I was just so infused by the fact that I'd got my inbox to zero at the time, and I was doing these certain things, and I just fell into teaching other people about it, because wherever I was working, I was talking in really excited terms about my own productivity, and people were like, show us, tell us, and that's where it came from. And it was never the sort of career path I expected. But when I found it, I was like, oh yeah, this is my home. This is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Cool.
So that's really where I've been at ever since, really, for the past sort of just over a decade. And yeah, still in love with helping people to do their best work, for sure.
It's cool because it's like you were your own guinea pig. So you're trying out all these different models on
Absolutely,
yourself.
yeah.
So if you think about like the product process or offering a service, it's like, what does someone want?
Yeah.
Well, it's like, this is what I really needed, and I figured this out for myself. And now you're passing off that experience. Some of the big areas you mentioned there were procrastination, attention, and whatnot. And I think attention obviously is a great place to start, because with everything that's going on in terms of the media, that's number one. But in terms of just your iPhone, your laptop, everything in a whole, like how much you think attention really affects productivity in terms of throughout the day, and is there different ways to how we can categorize maybe like approaching your attention span, or
Yeah.
how can we single down a single focus, because as we all know, everything else is going on but the work you need to be doing.
Yeah, so I guess I'm probably best known for my book, How to Be a Productivity Ninja. And so I'll just share one of the things that's from that book around attention. So what I say is two things. One is just forget trying to manage time. Time management doesn't matter. It doesn't really exist. It's not important. But instead of that, think about how you manage attention. And what I talk about in the book is the idea of 3 levels of attention. So on the one hand, you have this really good energy and attention, which I call proactive attention. So the kind of energy that you've got where you can really just do any of the things that are on your to-do list. You've got this real capability, you're going to problem solve really well. You're going to be creative. On the other end of that extreme, you've got inactive attention, right? So we've all had those Thursday afternoons where you're just like scrolling up and scrolling down on the inbox, and it's like the lights are on and no one's home, and you've just got no energy, and you're just tired. And by the way, that's a really natural state when it comes to productivity. I'll maybe come on to that in a minute, just in terms of the law of diminishing returns with productivity. Like we actually just don't have very much attention. And then you've got like the bit in the middle where you can do some things but not everything, and you're not necessarily capable of doing the most difficult things. So if you start to just think about your attention in those 3 ways, right? So basically, like the really amazing proactive attention, 2 to 3 hours a day. Then you've got the inactive attention, probably an hour or 2 a day of that. And then you've got the bit in the middle, and actually start to structure how you work, how you make choices, how you organize into those different levels of attention. So you're really clear with yourself which bits of work need that proactive attention. Once you start to do that, then really how you manage that 2 to 3 hours of proactive attention is all you need to worry about when it comes to productivity. The rest of it just kind of looks after itself. But really, it's amazing it's amazing to me when you really like get conscious about screening out distractions and being really intentional with that 2 to 3 hours a day. It's amazing the output that you can produce just from that. And so you don't really need to be just in this constant focus of productivity, which I think can actually be distracting, to think about productivity too much. So
Mhm.
you want to really find the ways to get the best bang for your buck, and then just the rest of the time you can just be a bit more easy on yourself.
That's interesting because like people think that the 9 to 5 day, it's the full duration. I need to be able to have
Yeah.
that consistency. Do you think there's different ways to like maximize that window? So like, is it working in small sprints of 40 minutes or whatnot? Because let's say for myself, so I used to finish university 2 years ago, and a common like study techniques would be like you're 40 minutes on, 5 minutes off. But funnily enough, I found that for myself not to be that helpful because I take 40 minutes on and 20 minutes off, so I was fitting
Yeah.
a model for myself, which was like 2 hours of work, and then I kind of worked out for myself. But do you feel there's different ways to try improve or optimize that window of productivity?
Yeah, so I think don't think of it so much as about managing time, 40 minutes on, 5 minutes off, whatever. Think about it more as like I've got three different differing levels of resource, right? And so that proactive attention, like the first thing is work out when that is for you in the day. And the only real way to do that is spend a week or two, just with a little notepad on your desk or just a little note in your phone or something where it's like, these were the hours in the day where I really felt the most awake, the most engaged, the most productive. Like just work that out for a couple of weeks. And what you'll notice is patterns. The science of this is that most people have that, tend to have that more in the morning than in the afternoon. Most people's energy is much more front loaded in the day. And mine, funny enough, used to be in my 20s, it was much more of like a kind of night owl evening energy. And now I'm much more mornings. Might be something to do with having a kid. I don't know, but I'm definitely much more mornings now. But that's the first thing. Figure that out. And then really think about what you want to put your attention on during that 2 to 3 hours. And I'm not actually necessarily talking about which bit of work on your to-do list you want to put your attention on, but like what else is going to have your attention. So turning off other things that are on the screen, maybe putting a phone blocker on, mode onto your phone so that your phone is not going to disrupt you during those times. Are you going to have music? Are you going to be in a space that's an open plan office with loads of people or not? And just those things that are almost like on the periphery of your attention. If you can start to screen those out so you create that much bigger space, then you'll just find it much easier to concentrate. It's much easier to concentrate when you don't have distractions, right? So the point is to do the thinking up front and work out how you can eliminate some of those things and just kind of get them out of the way.
And like that's very much subjective to the individual. So it obviously would depend on what's better. So some people enjoy the coffee shop sound, where some people need the isolation. So
For sure.
those changing different effects, even with working from home. So I actually think I'm more productive at home because I have the autonomy to work, as you say, earlier because it suits me better. Maybe the evenings then I can kind of take kind of chill. But how do you kind of approach different areas, even like procrastination? So, like you mentioned earlier, which is like the build up of having to do something. So, if you're trying to identify it, I kind of feel more in the evening, this is more applicable because it's like it's on my mind all day and I'm waiting to do this task. But do you feel that this is something that can be mitigated? Like, how can you mitigate it really? And really, like, is there any different way to approach it? Because even myself, when I'm editing a podcast or I have to review an upload or review a caption or review a post, I put on the long finger and then I do it, and it's 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and it's
Yeah.
not that
Yeah.
difficult because we've built up these patterns and habits at this stage now. It's just about getting to the work. But why is it so difficult to get up and do something that you know you can do?
Yeah. So, well, I meant there's so much I can say to that. The first thing probably to say is that the amount of times that you spend all day carrying a task around, right? And it's like, oh, I have to do this. I don't want to do this. And, your mind is just constantly coming back to it. And that kind of sense of dread or fear that I'm going to get started on this thing and it's going to be hard or don't really want to do it. And then when you do actually do it, it's just, oh, turns out this is really easy. Turns out I can do this in 20 minutes, right? So
Mhm.
what that tells me straight away is that there's something else going on other than just our ability to pick up task, do task, right? There's a whole inner narrative going on here that we need to first be aware of, and then start to put some tactics in place to kind of get around. Now, where that inner narrative comes from is really interesting. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is basically if you cut the brain and look at one of those kind of biology models or whatever, the amygdala is the bit at the back. It's part of the limbic system of the brain. And it's often referred to as the lizard brain. And the reason for that is it's the part of the brain that we have that lizards have, but lizards only have that. So it's the survivalistic part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that deals with territory, jealousy, hunger, being part of the tribe, being sheltered, being warm, survivalistic instincts. It's really interesting how that part of the brain holds us back so much and actually shouts louder than the logical, part of the brain that we have, which is much more measured and, can be much more thought through. And so the reason for that is that it's the evolutionary part of the brain, right? We've had that part of the brain the longest. It's the part of the brain that keeps us alive. And so it has a lot to say and it talks loud. So why that's important is a very long way of saying but why that's so important for work. If you've ever been in a meeting where everyone has to go around the table and say their name, and it's the person before you and you're next, and you're sat there and you're thinking, oh, don't screw this up. Lizard brain, right? That's the lizard brain, right? And it's the part of the brain that's like, I don't want to stand out. I want to blend in and be accepted. And I don't want to be judged. And, I want to be a success by being safe. Like that's what the lizard brain is set up to do and think. The time for me where it's the most active, that part of the brain, I remember just before I released How to Be a Productivity Ninja, the first book, I spent one whole evening looking at 1-star reviews of every business book I could find on Amazon. And it was like, why am I doing that? Like completely pointless. But of course, it's my lizard brain going, don't do this. Don't put this book out into the world. It's going to be risky. Your existing clients will leave you because they'll think the book's awful. And then your business will go bankrupt and then you'll have to just close it down and then you'll have to go and move back in with your mum. Right. And so like, that's the lizard brain narrative. So we have this all the time. And I think, one thing that you can try to do is just be more mindful of where those emotions are coming from. And a nice little exercise you can do around this is if you just look down your to-do list and then just think about your physical, and I mean physical reactions to each of the items on there. So there might be a couple where you read that to-do list item and you just feel a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more warm. But there will be some on that list where you read that to-do list item and you feel your shoulders tense up a little bit, or you feel like your heart race a little bit. And it's like, those are the things where there's maybe judgment, there's some fear, there's maybe some guilt that you didn't do it great the last time. There's maybe confrontation in there. There might be some difficult or awkward conversations or some emotional vulnerability, or all of those things play into procrastination. And that's a big part of where procrastination comes from. So if we can start to be mindful of that, meditation is a really great way to start noticing those things, and just being aware of your sort of embodied sensations around, when you're managing your own self and your own stuff. Once you can start to be mindful of that, then you can start to do some different things about it. And a lot of that comes down to, creating momentum is a big part of this. One way you can create momentum is externally. So putting a deadline in someone else's world. I will be at a meeting on Monday at 12 and I'll be showing you the report then. And it's like, oh, right. So now I had a worry about being judged for the report. Now I have a bigger worry, which is like, I don't want to be in a meeting with nothing to say and no report. So suddenly, because I've created a bigger fear, I've got momentum externally. But also you want to think about, that's stressful, right? So you also want to think as much as possible about how can you create momentum internally. And all that's about the language that we use with ourselves as we're writing our to-do list. So making sure that rather than just saying project or like essay or, report or like phone call or whatever, it's like, you've got it really specifically listed out as what I call in the book, a next physical action. So literally like, what's the next thing I need to do to get this started? What does it physically look like? If I'm a fly on the wall in my office and I'm looking down at me doing it, what does it physically look like? And how can I just articulate it in that kind of way, which is a bit longer than how most people write down to-do list items, right? Exactly, but when you do that, you immediately have that picture in your mind of how you're going to start it. So you almost have the momentum. It's almost like you've half started it before you really have. And it's really easy to then pick those up and almost like trick the lizard brain into getting started. So yeah, procrastination, I mean, it's one of those things, I don't think you can eliminate it, but you can totally you can totally get savvy with how you manage yourself around it, for sure.
I really like that. I really like that because I think the big thing is when you're planning out these things, it's often so difficult to know what you need to do, your first step. And that's where all the anxiety comes from. And it's like, well, I know that I'm working on this, but I don't really know what to do. So I actually don't use a to do list in terms of paper. I use a spreadsheet. And my girlfriend
Yeah.
thinks that I'm actually insane as a result because it's all conditionally formatted. But I would have like the topic, description, the status, and then a comment afterwards because the comment will lead into the next stage generally. And I
Yeah.
guess lets me get to like a little lower level of detail, and I can tag who I need to. Well, not tag it externally, it's just internal tagging, and then I can have a bit of a understanding. But you touched on something really interesting as well about deadlines and stress. So when I was in university or in general now, I always found there was two types of people. There was one person that would get an assignment 4 weeks from now, and they would start it right away, have it finished right away, and get, let's say, 70%. There was someone else who would get an assignment, start it the night before, and also get 70% the next day. And I could never figure out how one could be on one side and another on the other side. And I was usually the person who would be actually proactive. So usually I don't like the anxiety and stress of being behind. So I'll have a podcast being ready for it to be uploaded 3 weeks from now, just because I prefer to just be proactive. But it's funny because
Yeah.
it doesn't make the quality any better. Like the way I write it, the way I speak in it, or the way it's put together is nowhere better, but it's just prepared earlier. So that's quite interesting. And what I want to kind of ask was around that, around, you know, optimal levels of productivity per someone's priority. And do you think working under high stress environments of a tight window or larger window or larger windows is necessarily better from a psychological perspective, or is it more of a personal preference?
Well, it's a question that I get asked a lot. A lot of people will say, if I say to them, "When are you most productive?" A lot of people will say to me, "Oh, it's when I'm on a deadline." Right. So there's definitely a feeling that a lot of people have, which is like deadlines make me productive. But I would say that, like, yes, a deadline can force you into that decisiveness because it's like, I have to, it's back to that lizard brain thing. I've got a bigger fear of I don't want to miss the deadline. So now I have to start. Like, that's why you start the essay the night before. That's why your behavior switches, because it's like suddenly now my bigger fear is, well, there is no fear about getting, 68 versus 70. Now the fear is if I hand it in a day late, I lose 5% automatically. So, oh,
Mhm.
well, I better hand in something that's a 62, right? So
Yeah.
you just automatically change how you think about that stuff because of that. I would say that there's nothing wrong with deadlines, and sometimes a deadline can be a really nice motivator, particularly when you don't have an intrinsic internal motivation, when you need that kind of external, kind of momentum to kind of force it out of you. But what I'd say on the other hand of that is deadlines are a really expensive way to get stuff done because they're stressful, and you don't want to. Ideally, you don't want to lead the majority of your working life through deadlines because it's just a very stressful way to be. So the better way to get that momentum is through really clear thinking, being really specific, as you were saying there, about what you're going to write down and what the commitment actually looks like, how you measure what the outcome looks like, how you write down specifically that next physical action of what you need to do to get started. You almost want to look at it as like, do the thinking up front, so often work is a mixture of thinking and defining a task and then actually working on it. And what we tend to do is leave in the back of our minds and leave till the last minute, both the thinking and the doing part of it. And we're slightly vague on what the thinking is because we haven't finished the thinking. And so what you see on people's to-do list is this very kind of vague list of stuff. But if you do all of the thinking up front, then you've already got momentum on all those things. So you're going to have to do that thinking eventually. Why not just bring that forward? And the reason we often don't, so Henry Ford has a lovely quote, which is, thinking is the hardest work there is, which is the probable reason so few engage in it. And I think we are just, as a species, just generally quite lazy, right? So it's like, why would I think about this thing that I'm going to do in 3 weeks' time when I can just go and sit and watch Netflix or go and eat my dinner or whatever else I'm going to do? But just giving yourself your future self, that gift of having done the thinking and being clearer on it, is just it's a huge gift. And one of the things I practice in the book, and sort of practice in my life is this idea of having a weekly review, which I first came across from David Allen's book, Getting Things Done. And basically it's a checklist, and you go through this checklist and it's like, here's all the things on my calendar, and here's all the things on my project list, and all the projects I'm working on, and like, here are all the questions I'm going to ask myself. And like, when you go through this process once a week, I tend to do mine like Friday mornings these days, and it's like by Friday lunchtime, I just feel so much clearer and lighter, and and just much more confident that I can just switch off for the weekend and just be relaxed and not be in that kind of slightly nervous mode about what's about to blow up on me, right? So that's not free. That feeling of being able to be relaxed and in control in your work, like, you've got to do a decent level of thinking. But I don't think I do more thinking than anyone else. I think I actually probably do a bit less, because if you start to do that efficiently in one go, you don't have to think all through the week. You can just deliver the work, right? It's like momentum's really easy when your to-do list is that clear.
It's like bulk doing something. So you're either
Yeah.
bulk thinking about how you're going to go about do a
Yeah, it's
project,
just
or
batching it up, right? Yeah, same
batching.
as
Sorry,
emails.
that's kind of it's exact same thing,
Yeah.
just going through it at one go. How do you approach things like that? So to break them out into different categories. So especially when you're working from home, remote working, and the onus is really on yourself. And we know productivity is not linear; it's quite non-linear, and you're coming and going. How do you think the best approach is to face things like your email list, or to approach your project work? So if you're familiar with Agile or Kanban or any of this, like, we all know that our tasks are generated to us in some sort of management software. It could be Jira, a Microsoft TFS, or whatever. So we have this huge list of tasks which are assigned to us, huge email list, all these meetings, because you know on any given day I could spend 5 hours in a meeting, 4 hours in a meeting. And that's just reality of life, applicable to everyone else. So how do you kind of approach those different mechanics of a normal day in work?
Yeah. Well, before I get into that, I'm just going to pick it up on 5 hours
Of
in
course.
meetings being the reality of life, right? So the new book,
Oh,
this is the new
yes.
book, How to Fix Meetings. And what we say in that book is two seemingly oppositional things. One is, there are certain meetings that are just our gift to the world, and there are very few places in our lives now where we really generously share attention with other people, and we need to do that, and it matters, and it's really important to get those meetings right. The other thing we say is, everyone's having too many meetings, and too many meetings that suck, right?
Yeah.
So I think we all have a duty to not say, this is the reality of life, like 5 hours a day meetings. We have a duty to go back and say, you want me in this meeting? Okay, well, firstly, there's no agenda. Secondly, what's the purpose of it? Thirdly, what purpose do I serve in it? Like, we need to be much more critical with each other about the meetings that are created, because let's face it, so many meetings are created because someone sits at their desk and says, I don't know how to move forward with this thing. I need to feel in my body like I have some kind of momentum. How can I get a dopamine hit? I know, I'll set up a meeting. That
Yeah.
happens all the time, right? And
Meetings
it's
about
so,
meetings.
yeah, and it's so disrespectful to everybody else's time, right? Because if you set up a meeting with 5 people, you've just cost your company 5 hours of time, right? And everybody's got work to do in order to be at that meeting, in terms of preparing for it and being there. And it's like, you could have just sent an email or made a decision. You didn't need to rob the organization of 5 hours of time to make that happen. So I think, particularly when everyone's feeling this Zoom fatigue, I just think we need to question that reality. I feel like it's really sad to me that HSBC coming out the other day saying we're going to have Friday afternoons with no Zoom calls, and that's like celebrated as this like radical thing. How about we have some weeks with no Zoom calls, right? Like, really think deeply about when we're getting together and sharing attention in that way. And then when we do have a couple of meetings that are genuinely going to be the things that add the creativity, solve the problems, spark the project off that we really need to do, make them amazing. So like, it feels like those two things are contradictory, but they're not. Like, it's actually easier to serve the 2 or 3 meetings that we really need if people aren't fatigued of having 10 others. And and that is a vital component of productivity. Like, productivity on the one hand is the yang of like, get your head down, say no to everything, do the stuff that really matters. And it's also on the other hand the yin, right, which is like, reflective, listening, connection, really being deeply intuitive with each other. And we kind of need both of those energies to make stuff work. But that was a very long thing that I just thought was really important to say. But for me, like in approaching stuff like doing my weekly checklist, getting my email inbox to zero, working on stuff, there's a couple of things that I'd say that I think are really helpful. One is I could count on one hand the number of people I've met in 12 or 13 years of coaching people around productivity who have anything in their calendar that says something like processing emails, right? We know that we have this job to do. We know that it takes time, and yet we don't ever acknowledge that, right? So actually have some times to be intentional around email. And the flip side of that is, because you've got some times to be intentional about email, also give yourself some times where you turn it off. So back to the attention management thing. If I'm trying to write, which I'm doing at the moment, I'm working on a new book at the moment, I don't check my email while I'm writing. Like, that would be insane, So don't have it just on in the background all day. Is a really good starting point. Start your day with a little daily sort of check-in with yourself, a little daily review, as I call it. So where am I up to? What are my 2 or 3 big rocks for the day, like the big priorities that I want to hit? And then everything else will fall in around that. If you have 5 or 6 big rocks, you have no big rocks. So you've got to start with, 1, 2, or 3 maximum, like never more than 3. That's my rule. And then, in terms of more weekly routines, so like for me, the weekly checklist is always in my calendar, recurring thing for Fridays. But then, like, if something else happens on a Friday, I know it's my duty to myself to kind of move that, and never to deprioritize it where it doesn't happen. So the thing is, once you do those things, you realize how precious the rest of your time and attention really is, because that weekly review is a couple of hours of my week. My emails 3 or 4 hours of my week. Like, suddenly I'm dwindling the number of hours that are actually available to do really quality work. And then it's much easier to say no, I think, because, you're just aware of what your constraints and your limits are.
I completely agree as well, because even when you're working and even meetings that are split, so they could be, let's say, 9, 11, 3, and 5, the hours in between are never going to be that hugely productive. Actually,
Yeah.
a colleague
Yeah.
said to me recently, he said that if I have a 2 hour gap, I don't get as much done in an hour if I had a meeting at a split over the course of 2 hours. So if, let's say, if it was 1 o'clock, you had a meeting and you had a meeting at 3 o'clock, well, the space in between 1 hours isn't as effective as having a 2 hours, is a better way to put it. Sorry, I made that more
Massively.
complicated.
Yeah.
But it's funny because there's that kind of, getting up to speed and getting it, kind of leaning into your workload and then getting in. So that's why it's quite interesting to see just like how it could be mitigated by reducing meetings or making them effective and making it right decision makers. And I think that myself as well, having the right decision makers in the room, because we don't need 15 people if we don't need 15 people in a call. It's interesting because if you think about it in terms of a
Sure.
room, if you were to bring people into a room, an office, if you had a small office, you wouldn't be putting 20 people in one room, would you?
Mm. Well, Jeff Bezos had at Amazon for years this meeting policy called the 2 pizza rule, right? Which is basically never have a meeting where you couldn't feed everybody in there with 2 large pizzas, right? So you can have 4 or 5 people maximum on a meeting, but once you get to 7 or 8, it's just not an optimum way to make decisions. So actually
100%.
fewer people gets you a higher output, which is a weird sort of contradictory thing, but
Mhm.
yeah.
I have a recommendation for you for your podcast. Colin Burr. He was not one of the originals on Amazon, but he was within the first like 3 4 years. He was
Oh, cool.
director. He was directly working with Jeff Bezos. He was like his technical advisor. But he goes on about the 2 pizza teams and
Mm,
how they build scalable processes. So essentially, making it all about the customer focus, never ever looking at anything else, which is quite interesting. It's
yeah.
seems quite obvious right now, but they had no other eyes for anything else, but what they were doing was all customer centric. So that feeds into productivity, how it was built, and how the whole company functioned and yielded together. But yeah, it could be a recommendation for your own podcast. He's very active in that space as well. Came out a book about Amazon as well.
Yeah,
Um,
that sounds cool. I think Bezos is really interesting. So for me, I don't necessarily agree with. So there's a kind of way that he sees the world. I remember seeing a really interesting sort of opinion piece article. I think it's the New York Times a couple of years ago, and it just said, "What does Jeff Bezos actually want?" Right, and like there was that thing where he presented to Amazon's board, and it was like, here is the total retail spend, and then here is like the proportion of our market share, and it was like 1% or something. And then it dawned on all these people on the board of Amazon that he was actually counting, people selling street food in India, like that's in his description of retail. Every corner shop in the world, like every petrol station in the world that sells a Mars bar, like all these things, he was counting his percentage share of that. And it's like, dude, you don't have to run everything. So there's something about that level of ambition which I find a little bit I find it a little bit suspicious. And I think
Mm,
he certainly, has some work to do, I think, in terms of like, how he treats the staff, and kind of, both in terms of wages and the way they're monitored so heavily that feels very punitive. And there's a lot of stuff I don't like about him, but I do think that his philosophy of every day is day one within your
mm,
company, and to really like, like start without that sort of mindset of we're in this huge company, but like start every day with that blank state. It's day one of the company. Let's go. I think is incredible. I think his ability to just build and scale is just, I mean, it's astonishing. And I do think probably when the dust settles on like this era, I think he'll just undoubtedly be seen as like the greatest business mind of his generation. So like some of the things that he does, I find really interesting. Another thing he does, which I like, is he has these meetings called silent meetings. And like the first 20 minutes of the meeting, there's everyone gets given a printed copy of what they're there to talk about. It can never be longer than 6 pieces of paper, right? 6 pages, A4 pages of paper, and less if possible. And basically, the premise is, well, we know everyone's busy. So we know that you'll all have arrived having not read the papers. So let's read the papers properly first in silence,
crazy.
and then we'll start actually talking about it. And I just think that as a way to make sure that the 40 minutes that comes after that is really quality conversation. It's like, on the one hand, it's genius. And on the other hand, it's like, why is this not the most obvious thing that everybody else is doing in the world? So I just think the way he sees the world, and the way he is able to solve some of those very human problems. Yeah,
Mhm.
I just think he's a fascinating person to think about and study and model.
That's so interesting, especially from the fact of when everyone opens a call now, everyone's like, "Have you read the page?" And they're like, no, I haven't got into it." So that's what makes
Yeah,
it, like
and
people
everyone's
just don't have
blagging.
time. Yeah,
Everyone's blagging it, and so how good's the conversation going to be if we know everyone's blagging it, we're blagging it. So
yeah.
so like actually having that time to read it, I think I think you either have to have. I did work for a boss early on in my career who was a very big, like his style was very influenced by his kind of love of British military history and all this like big naval kind of
Mhm.
sort of interest, read all the books and stuff. And he would start every meeting. He's a very alpha guy, and I will start by assuming that everyone has read the papers. And he would like eyeball you like this going around the table. And it was a kind of fear-based approach where everyone did read all the papers, because you knew you had to sit in that room, and it was quite intimidating. And I think you either do it like that, or you do it like Jeff, which is like, yeah, we know everyone's busy. You won't have read it. Here's 20 minutes, practical,
Get into it.
in that sense, quite a compassionate approach. And, you know, most people are just stuck in the messy middle of that, aren't they?
Of course, of course. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Kind of feeds nicely into our last segment around just like employer-employee relationships around communication and productivity. So what I've often found is that really the leader of the company or the leader of the team is a big influence in the overall productivity. So I've worked with terrible managers, I've worked with great managers, and I've worked with people that I like really look up to. And I feel like that
Yeah.
when you align with someone that you really look up to, you're way more motivated to do the difficult stuff or the stuff that you can't really do, or if you don't know how to do it, you're more comfortable communicating why you can't do it, and then you'll come to a solution. So that's been really
Yeah.
big for me over the last like couple of years. But like from your own side and your own kind of like research in terms of communication and building a good sustainable culture in an organization, how do you think that's been influential? I know the word culture is always kind of used, but it's about like, okay, how is it actually on the floor, on the ground, integrated into a team with, several people, or could be 20 people in a team these days?
Yeah, there's loads I could say about that. I want to just ask you a question first before I jump into it. So you said you've worked with really good managers and also worked with some terrible ones. I'd love
Mhm.
to know what you learned from the terrible ones.
What I learned from the terrible ones. I learned that when I become a manager, I would never want the people that are reporting into me to feel like alienated and isolated away from me and working in silos, because I felt worked with people that have been too busy. Like doesn't they've been too busy to like
Yeah,
work on an issue, and I could have just asked them, like it could be something very basic, it could be something to do with Excel, could be something as simple as a formula trying to figure it out, and they have indirectly or directly said that they were too busy. And even the body language, even back in the office, tells more to me than telling me that
yeah,
it's too busy. So then subconsciously, I was never inclined to go out of my way, Whereas now, my manager, who's my friend and we're very close and everything, I'll ping him and be like, hey, I don't know how to do this. Can you hop on a call for 2 minutes? He'll hop on a call, we'll fix it out, and I won't ask him again because I know that I know it. And they're
yeah.
things that I kind of look retrospectively, and I think, when I get to that stage, which I don't know, it could be in a couple of years, but I want to be able to pass off that knowledge, and that kind of positive relationship, I think, is the main
Yeah.
focus.
And yeah, I would say my experience of bad managers is similar, but also I've had been really lucky actually just to have some really great role models as managers and leaders in the early part of my career. And then I've also been like super lucky that for a large chunk of my career, because I started my own business, I get to set the culture, which is just, it's an astounding thing that I look back on it now. Like, so when I started Think Productive, I don't know, I was maybe just below 30. And I actually don't know how, like looking back on it now, I think if I was starting a new company now, I would feel such a weight of responsibility knowing how important culture is, that every decision I was making in those early stages had such a knock-on effect to people's lives. But when I was just below 30, I just wasn't aware of that responsibility. So I was just gung-ho doing it. And
Mhm.
luckily, I think I did a pretty good job of it. But I just think it's such a sort of privilege in the real sense of that word, of like, this is such a responsibility to to really help shape how other companies do this. But I'll just give you a couple of observations I think that have really uh, first of all, they've really helped me and my company Think Productive, but also when I talk about these things with clients, so with big organizations, things that just tend to resonate as well. One thing is, if you can start to have those conversations like actually on the table rather than as subtext around when people have the best attention to do their best work, how they're feeling in that moment, whether they're stuck. If you can surface all those things and have them actually on the table rather than them be things that everyone's just kind of holding to themselves or whispering about in a corner, then you're onto something. So really opening up that communication, the channels of communication, the transparency of that, and making it okay that something doesn't go great, right? So one of the things in Productivity Ninja is a ninja is a human and not a superhero. So you do all this great productivity stuff, and you will look like a superhero. It will look like you have special powers, but you don't. You're just a human with limitations, and also, humans are, let's be honest, humans are weird. We're a weird species. We have a weird load of stuff going on in our brains the whole time. It's amazing that we're as productive as we are, given just how many foibles and sort of weirdnesses we have in the back of our heads. So bringing that humanness to the table, but like really embracing it, I think really counts. We do a daily huddle within Think Productive, and one of the questions, we have 5 questions in this huddle, and the 4th question just before we finish is like, where are you stuck today? And that does 2 things. It allows people that confidence and building the muscle of being able to talk about, I'm struggling with this thing, I don't know what I'm doing. And also it almost creates the space and the permission where like every day you're allowed to be stuck on something, right? So as well as learning how to talk about it, it's like it's assumed that you will be stuck. Like it doesn't assume that people are going to be perfect all the time and do it really well. So having those things like on the table, I think is a really huge thing. And then the other thing I would say that has really influenced how I work, I remember years and years ago watching, it was a Channel 4 documentary about Jamie Oliver, and he was building his 15 social enterprise, which for those of you who don't know the story of it, it was in Old Street in East London, very cool part of London. And he brought together all these people who had not had jobs and they were unemployed and they were really struggling. And he's like, I'm going to turn you into the chefs and the kitchen porters and the waiting staff and whatever. The restaurant was called 15 because there's 15 people in that first cohort. And I remember he was really struggling with this young woman who just had a lot going on in her personal life. And she came into work in tears, all this stuff going on. And he just said to her, look, you've got all this stuff in your family life that is going on right now. Go home and deal with that. How do I expect you to focus on your work when that's going on? Go sort that out and then come back, And I think we have this mentality often of, the sort of stiff upper lip mentality, the kind of keep calm and carry on, like just do your work and just get through these hard times or whatever. But like that really had an effect on me watching that sort of approach from Jamie Oliver, just being very pragmatic. And sort of ever since, I've kind of adopted that, and I've sort of in more recent years kind of turned it into this little sort of phrase or mantra that I use quite a lot. And I've got blog posts about it as well. And it's just called people first, work second, always. And what I've developed around that is a couple of things. So people first, work second is basically about saying, if you've got something, if you're ill, if you've got something going on in your life, that means, let's be honest, when you get to work, you're not going to be focused on, on this stuff that we need to do on our deadline, because let's face it, like this other stuff's really important and you're going to be distracted by it. Then that's always going to be the case, right? So if you're in that situation, don't try and work through it. Don't try and be at work. Like, so giving people that space, giving people the time off if they need time off, giving people the compassion to just be in work as a way to take their mind off it. If that's what they need to, then cool. But just like recognizing that interplay between like personal life and work life, I think is massive. And the always part of it is the critical bit, right? Because it's like, that's all very well, but we're on a massive deadline now. We've got this big client thing. No, it's always. The phrase is always. And that means no matter how busy I am, I've actually had this like really recently, I was like really busy. Someone who works for me was really struggling. I was like, this is my responsibility to deal with, not yours. You go and do your stuff, sort that stuff out, and so it's my job to take that burden on if that's what needs to be done. That's what responsibility is. So it's always in that way, but it's also always in another way, which is it's always somebody's always. So there's always somebody around you that needs support, needs help. And if you think like that, and it's always somebody's always, if I'm lucky enough to be engaged in my work and not have stuff going on in the rest of my life and be healthy and be like up for it and ready, like it's my responsibility to go and look for that stuff and like work out who is in that always moment right now and like needs help one way or another. So yeah, people first, work second, always has just become this like little mantra of the business. One of our corporate values at Think Productive is trust and kindness are our rocket fuel. And that's not a fluffy thing. That's about saying when we know that we have a level of empathy and trust within the team, we can just trust people to get on and do stuff. And we know they're motivated, because guess what? If you give someone the time off when stuff's hard, when they come back, they are so thankful for that. And also they're looking out for somebody else as always. So just builds this like huge, sort of empathetic connection across the team.
That's awesome.
And for me, that's been like, it's just always been how I've operated, and like I've started to articulate it in recent years. And like this next book I'm doing is a leadership book, and there's going to be a lot of that stuff in there around, the sort of the human side of work and the human side of productivity, and how when you behave like that, where you end up is what psychologists and HR people refer to as psychological safety, which is basically feeling safe enough in your work that you're able to contribute the slightly wacky idea, and you're able to speak up if you're the one person in the room that disagrees and you're quite junior, but like, I've got a different idea, I think you're all wrong. Like that stuff actually makes teams better. It makes for better performance. It makes for better productivity. It makes for better creativity. it's not fluffy. Like this is, it feels fluffy because it means that people are working in a nicer environment, but actually like it's just a cornerstone to success as well, right? So
Mhm.
that's the win-win. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I think about culture, and yeah, definitely just something that I'm very, very passionate about as well.
It's the ultimate autonomy given to an employee versus your old boss who was the military approach, and that's the beauty
Yeah.
of it. We're unfortunately out of time. I could probably do this for 2 or 3 more hours, but I just wanted to say, obviously, firstly, a massive thank you. Secondly, wish you the very best in the writing of the new book and the new release that's coming up. I have no doubt it's going to be a great success. That's great, and hopefully it'd be cool to do something again when your next book comes up to leadership, something like
Yeah,
that,
for
because
sure. Yeah,
another
happy
kind of
to.
angle, would be pretty sweet. But let's say a massive thank you, and I appreciate it.
Pleasure. And if people want to connect, it's just go to grahamallcott.com/links, and just everything I'm doing is just all there. So
Awesome.